As Time magazine aptly said, 2024 is not just an election year, it is the election year. 2 billion people in more than 60 countries, accounting for half of the world's population, have already voted or are about to, in a year that has been billed as the biggest test of democracy. What do the results so far tell us about the current state of the world? What do they say about what voters really care about? Should we be more or less concerned about the threat of populism? What are the investment implications? This week, we got the election results of 3 very important developing countries: India, Mexico, and South Africa. All 3 are members of the G20. India and South Africa are also members of the BRICS. In all 3 elections, the ruling party won the most votes. In Mexico, the president-elect Claudia Sheinbaum's coalition won 2/3 of the seats in the lower house and nearly 2/3 of the seats in the upper house. In India and South Africa, while the ruling parties remained the largest parties, they lost their majority. In India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's BJP lost 63 seats and for the first time since 2014 need to rely on coalition partners to govern. In South Africa, the ANC received only 40% of the votes and lost its absolute majority for the first time since the end of apartheid. The results of all 3 elections took the market by surprise. Morena was widely expected to win, but few people expected a total landslide. The Indian stock market dropped 6% on the news that BJP lost its majority. Nobody expected ANC to do well, but it did even worse than expected, and the South African rand fell hard as the results came in. How do we make sense of the results of these 3 elections? Are they really as surprising as they look? Elections should be a vote on the performance of the government. Do the election results in India, Mexico, and South Africa reflect the performance of the Moreno, BJP, and ANC governments? In particular, the economic performance of these governments. An improving standard of living requires growth, real growth. If we were to judge the performance of these 3 economies based only on their absolute GDP growth, India, which was the fastest growing economy in the world in 2023, came on top, followed by Mexico and then South Africa. However, comparing GDP growth across countries could be misleading, given they may not have the same trend growth rate. On this chart, I ranked the deviation from trend growth rate of all the G20 countries. Suddenly, Mexico is now neck and neck with India, and both grew significantly faster in 2023 than in the previous 10 years. In contrast, South Africa grew somewhat more slowly in 2023 than in the previous decade. More growth is better than less growth, as long as it does not come with too much inflation, since inflation erodes real purchasing power and hits the poor especially hard. In 2023, inflation was higher in South Africa than in Mexico and India, but the difference was small. As a group, these 3 countries did not do as well as the likes of China, South Korea, and Indonesia, but they did better than the UK and Germany. Again, these countries don't have the same trend inflation. Ranking their deviation from trend inflation, India did better in 2023 than South Africa and Mexico. But what about jobs? Job growth is necessary to ensure that everyone has a stake in the pie. In 2023, South Africa's unemployment rate was 32%, one of the highest in the world, let alone among the G20. India may be the fastest growing economy in the world, but its 8% unemployment rate was in the top quintile of the G20. In contrast, the unemployment rate in Mexico was only 2.8%, one of the lowest in the world. Ranking the deviation to trend unemployment rate, South Africa remains the worst performer among the G20. COVID has had the opposite effect on the South African labor market than on other countries. whereas most countries have seen a decline in their unemployment rate to below pre-pandemic levels. South Africa's unemployment rate is quite a bit higher than before the pandemic. We can be sure that ANC paid the price for it at the polls last week. In general, high economic growth, low inflation, and low unemployment rate make a strong economy. However, a strong economy also needs a healthy fiscal foundation. In 2023, Mexico was one of only 2 G20 countries that ran a primary surplus, meaning the income of its government was greater than its expenditures before interest. In second place was South Africa, that ran a small primary deficit that was just a little larger than that of Germany. India ran a primary deficit close to 3% of GDP that places it in the bottom third of the G20. Ranking the deviation from trend primary balance, Mexico still did better in 2023 than both South Africa and India. If we attach the same weight to each of these 4 attributes of economic performance, we can come up with a simple composite ranking by just adding up the rank positions of every country for each attribute. Here is the composite ranking. For 2023, Mexico was in 3rd place among G20 in terms of economic performance, just behind Russia and Brazil. India was in 6th place, between Australia and Canada. South Africa was in 13th place, between France and Argentina. My ranking of economic performance may be simple, but I think it gives us a fairly intuitive explanation for the election results in India, Mexico, and South Africa. The landslide victory of Morena in Mexico is consistent with the strong performance of the Mexican economy. In contrast, ANC's dismal election results are consistent with the weak performance of the South African economy. India didn't do as well as Mexico in our ranking, but it did much better than South Africa. BJP lost its majority, but was able to form a governing coalition relatively easily, whereas it is less clear that ANC can do the same. This simple ranking can also explain the results of other elections held early in the year. Russia is our top-ranked economy, and Putin won 88% of the votes in the Russian presidential election in March. Korea is in the bottom quintile of the ranking, and President Yoon Suk Yeol's People Power Party suffered a huge defeat in the legislative election, winning only 108 seats out of the 300 seats in the National Assembly. The relatively easy victory by Indonesia's new president, Prabowo Subianto, in the February election has been credited to the strong backing by the popular outgoing President Jokowi, whom Indonesian voters associate with Indonesia's strong economic performance. What does the ranking say about the EU parliamentary elections and the upcoming election in the UK and in the US? Germany is in last place of the ranking, and the UK barely ahead. We should expect Germany's Social Democrats and Green Party to get clobbered this weekend. As already predicted 2 weeks ago, the Labour Party in the UK will likely win an outright majority in the British general election on July 4th. What about the US? The US is in 7th place in the ranking, behind India and Canada. Not too great, but not too bad either. No slam dunk for either party. The race will be a competitive one. The analysis above shows that if there is a common thread running through all the elections so far this year, is that there is a fairly strong correlation between the election performance of the ruling party and the economic performance of the country. In other words, voters are voting with their wallets, as they should. Indeed, the results of the elections in 2024 so far suggest a high level of economic literacy among voters. More importantly, they're giving more importance to actual results than promises, rhetoric, or ideology. Mexico is a great example. President López Obrador has been described as a left-wing populist, but his success came from the fact that he is foremost a pragmatist. His greatest achievement was bringing down income inequality without building a welfare state. He used market solutions to promote his social agenda, and he ran a tight fiscal ship. I don't deny AMLO was also lucky. Mexico has replaced China as the biggest exporter to the US, with the US-China trade war having diverted production and trade to Mexico. But AMLO made the most out of his luck. This was why he exited with an unheard of 60% approval rating. Modi is also a populist, and the US-China trade war also benefited India. But his inability to boost India's employment growth cost his party its majority, notwithstanding his populist policies like the new citizenship law. Voters are smarter than you think. I think the election results in 2024 so far should mitigate concerns about populism as a threat to democracy. Elections have consequences, and not necessarily good ones. In my view, the ANC's loss of majority is long-term bearish for the South African economy and South African markets. South Africa faces fundamental challenges. The splintering of the ANC will only make it even more difficult politically to effect major reforms. President Cyril Ramaphosa, a former businessman, has been bogged down by scandals that have tainted his reputation and sapped his political capital. My guess is that he will become a lame duck president in the next government. The risk to my view is if the ANC decides to form a coalition with the pro-business Democratic Alliance, a scenario that does not look very likely at this moment. As for India, the biggest casualty of the BJP's loss of its majority will be New Delhi's decision-making process. Modi is known for his big and bold decisions that are executed quickly. It won't be easy for him to adapt to the consensus-driven process that is inevitable in any coalition government. With or without Modi, India will continue to benefit from the growing tension between the US and China. But I suspect that India will not be able to run as quickly in the new political configuration. I am more bullish about Mexico, at least the Mexican peso. AMLO is only 70. I think he will want to protect his legacy, and he will work for it. President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum is a scientist by profession, but she ran Mexico City for 4 years. During her term, crime rate fell by 50%. Mexico's biggest priority right now is to invest aggressively and quickly in infrastructure, especially in energy infrastructure, in order to capitalize the full potential of the nearshoring and friendshoring drive. Mexico does not need a political superstar right now, but it needs someone who knows how to get things done methodically and with competence. Sheinbaum seems to fit the bill